Welcome to the video. My name is Alexi, and on this channel I cover all things Azure. And today we're continuing our Data Factory series. And today's topic is going to be Data Factory triggers. In this video, I will cover the basics of Azure Data Factory triggers. After watching this video, you should have an understanding what are the different types of triggers in Azure Data Factory and how you can configure them and use them to orchestrate your pipeline runs. Let's start by covering all the different types of triggers in Azure Data Factory on conceptual level before covering them in practice in Azure Portal. So let's dive right in. Before diving into different types of triggers in Azure Data Factory, let's just first cover what is a trigger in Azure Data Factory. Let's start with our setup here. We have Data Factory pipeline that is copying data from Azure Blob storage to Azure SQL database. And we would like to get this pipeline triggered. And like the name implies, the trigger is the activity in the Data Factory that will trigger the pipeline and initiate the pipeline run that will copy the data from Azure Blob storage to Azure SQL database. Now, when we have the basic understanding what is a trigger, we can cover the different types of triggers in Azure Data Factory. First, we have a schedule trigger that is your basic time-based trigger. Then we have a tumbling window trigger that is also a time-based trigger, but triggers the pipelines in set intervals and adds a bit more complexity to configuration compared to schedule trigger. Then we have a storage event trigger that triggers the pipeline based on events that happen in storage account. Then we have a custom event trigger that triggers the pipeline based on custom events. And finally, we have the last trigger that is manual trigger, when you act as a trigger and trigger the pipeline from the Data Factory UI. Now let's cover schedule trigger in a bit more detail. And here we have the schedule trigger configuration, how it can be seen in the Data Factory UI. Let's digest this configuration in a bit more detail. Firstly, schedule trigger is a trigger that executes a pipeline on a regular schedule, meaning that we can say that execute this pipeline once per day at 11 a.m. We can configure also a time zone for this execution, and you can set it to your time zone if you want so. We have the configuration from the minute level to month level, so we can say, for example, execute this pipeline every 15 minutes or execute this pipeline every 30th day or last day of each month or so on. This trigger is fire and forget type, so it doesn't care what happens to the pipeline after the trigger has fired, and there is no way, for example, say that if the pipeline fails, please try to rerun it for a couple of times or so. And this difference will come a bit more clearer when we cover tumbling window triggers after the schedule trigger. The relationship with the pipeline with this trigger is many to many, meaning that one pipeline can have multiple schedule triggers and one schedule trigger can trigger multiple pipelines. Now let's go through a quick visual example how the schedule trigger works. First, we have the trigger configuration. Our trigger type is going to be schedule. Our start date is going to be January 3rd, 4 p.m. Our time zone is going to be UTC, and our recurrence is going to be daily at 11 a.m. So let's start running our timeline here. First, our trigger is created on January 1st, 9 a.m. Then our start date is set to January 3rd, 4 p.m., which means that the first time when our trigger will actually execute is January 4th at 11 a.m. When our trigger runs, it will trigger two pipelines because this schedule trigger is tied to two pipelines, pipeline 1 and pipeline 2. And they both start running after the trigger has executed. But our pipeline 2 fails, but nothing happens and it will stay in the failed state because in this trigger we don't have any policies to say that try to run that pipeline again if it fails. So we move forward. Then our second execution will happen on January 5th at 11 a.m. and again two pipelines, pipeline 1 and 2 are being executed. Now let's move forward to January 6th at 11 a.m. and our pipeline 1 is still running when our trigger is executing. However, our trigger doesn't care about the pipeline still running. It will start again two new pipeline runs for pipeline 1 and 2, and then we have a situation that our pipeline 1 is running at the same time. And this can be problematic in your environment. And there are pipeline level configurations that we can use to prevent this, but in the trigger itself, we don't have any configuration that would prevent this situation. In the tumbling window trigger that we're going to cover next, we have options to prevent this situation. Tumbling window is also a time-based trigger, and here we have the configuration for the tumbling window trigger as it's seen on the Data Factory UI. Tumbling window trigger is a bit different to schedule trigger because it executes a pipeline on a regular interval. So basically we can say that execute this pipeline every 1 hour or every day since the start date. So the start date and the time is the time when the intervals will start happening. Tumbling window offers way more configuration options compared to the schedule trigger, and it also supports this kind of a historical backfill that we can run it on tumbling windows that have happened in the past. But we're not going to cover this functionality in that detail in this video because we're going to come back to this after we have covered Data Factory parameters, because after we have covered those, this historical backfill will make much more sense, and for now it would have been bit too confusing to cover in this trigger basic video. Like the schedule trigger, we have the configurations from the minute level to month level. And this trigger actually supports dependencies to other triggers that the schedule trigger does not. And this is also a feature that we are not going to cover in that much detail in this video, but just keep in mind that with this trigger it is possible. And this trigger has concurrency and retry policies that were troubling in our previous example. So we can say that we only allow one instance of this trigger to be running at given time, and we can set a retry policy that if the pipeline fails, please try to run it for a few times. We can also define the interval in seconds, how fast the trigger will try to rerun the failed pipeline. This trigger has a one-to-one relationship with the pipeline, meaning that we can only have a one tumbling window per pipeline, and that's it. So we cannot have multiples like we could have with the schedule trigger. Now let's also do this quick visual animation for the tumbling window trigger to see how it works in the Data Factory. Let's first have our trigger configuration. Now our trigger type will be tumbling window, our start date will be January 3rd, 11 a.m. and we say that we want to run this tumbling window trigger every 24 hours. Concurrency for this tumbling window will be 1 and retry will be also 1. And now let's start running this on our timeline. First, our trigger is created on January 1st, 9 a.m. Then we have our start date, that is January 3rd, 11 a.m. So our first execution will be 24 hours after the start date on January 4th, 11 a.m. and it will start running our pipeline 1. However, our pipeline 1 will fail, but since we have defined the retry policy, the tumbling window will try to run it again, and now our pipeline succeeds and everything is fine. Let's go to our next execution that will happen on January 5th at 11 a.m. It will again trigger our pipeline 1 and it will start running. However, now our pipeline 1 takes way too long to run and it will overlap with our next tumbling window that will be on January 6th on 11 a.m. And what happens now is that since we have defined the concurrency to be 1, we cannot start running the pipeline again with this trigger. So we move forward until the pipeline has finished, and after that we can trigger our tumbling window trigger again, and that will be now on January 6th at 2 p.m. and then the pipeline 1 will start running again. As you can see, the tumbling window is a bit more difficult to configure and understand, but it will solve some issues that schedule triggers might have. Now let's just do a quick side-by-side comparison between these two time-based triggers so you really get the idea how they are different and you can choose the right trigger for your circumstances. The schedule trigger runs on a consistent time schedule and the tumbling window is a fixed interval. Schedule trigger is a fire and forget type, meaning that it doesn't care about the pipeline state at all and it will just fire and forget the pipeline after that. But the tumbling window waits for the pipeline state, so it is interested in how the pipeline run actually went. In the schedule trigger, we do not have pipeline level retries, but in the tumbling window, we have those. The schedule trigger doesn't support any dependencies to other triggers, but the tumbling window does support them. Schedule trigger does not support any kind of concurrency, so we cannot define that we can have only like 1 or 2 of this schedule trigger running at the same time, and this comes from the fire and forget nature of the trigger. But in the tumbling window, we can define the concurrency that we want. Schedule trigger has many-to-many relationship to pipeline, so we can trigger multiple pipelines with one schedule trigger, and we can have multiple schedule triggers tied to one pipeline. However, the tumbling window relationship is 1-to-1, so we can have one tumbling window per pipeline, and that's it. Next, let's cover storage events triggers. And here we have the Data Factory configuration for storage events triggers. And what this trigger does, it basically executes the pipeline based on a storage event that happens in the Azure storage account. Supported events are blob created and blob deleted. And we can configure some things related to those blobs. So we can say that the blobs in the set path that have certain ending only count as events for the trigger. And like schedule trigger, this trigger is many-to-many relationship with the pipeline, so we can have multiple storage event triggers tied to one pipeline and multiple pipelines tied to one storage event trigger. Next, let's run this same visual timeline animation for this trigger in order to see how it actually works in the Data Factory. Let's start with our trigger configuration. Our trigger type is now going to be storage events, and we define that the blob path must end with .csv. And our event is going to be blob created. So we are only monitoring blobs that are being created to the storage account. And we are going to ignore empty blobs. So we are not allowing our trigger to fire if the blob is empty. Now let's start running our timeline here. Our first blob has been created to the storage account, and it matches with all the criteria that we have defined. So it will run our trigger. It will trigger two pipelines because we have configured this trigger to run pipeline 1 and 2, and they will start running. However, the pipeline 1 will fail, but the trigger doesn't care about that because we don't have any retry policies that we can configure for this trigger like we have in the tumbling window trigger. Next, our second file is created, and that file also matches with our configuration. So it will trigger the pipeline run, and it will again trigger pipeline 1 and 2. And our third file has been created, but this time this file is empty, so it doesn't trigger any pipeline runs because we have decided to ignore empty blobs. Our fourth file has been created, but now it has .txt ending, so it won't trigger any pipeline runs. Our fifth file has been created, and it has the .csv ending, and it's not empty, so it will run our trigger, and this will trigger our pipeline 1 and 2. However, our pipeline 1 from the previous trigger is still running, and now we have again the situation where our pipeline 1 is running 2 times at the same time, because in this trigger we cannot define any concurrency in the trigger configurations to prevent this from happening. Lastly, we have the custom events trigger, and here we have the trigger configuration as it can be seen in the Data Factory UI. Basically, this trigger executes a pipeline based on a custom event that comes from the Azure Event Grid. And Event Grid is this kind of a messaging service in Azure that allows sending messages between Azure services. This trigger allows very flexible trigger integrations that you could trigger Data Factory pipelines from an event that happens in your other Azure applications. However, this is the most complex trigger to implement, and we are not going to cover this trigger in much detail in this video because I would consider this to be very lengthy and advanced topic to cover. So leave a comment to the comment section down below if you would like to see a dedicated video on custom events on this channel. This trigger has many-to-many relationship with the pipeline. So like with the storage event trigger and the schedule trigger, you can have multiple custom events triggers tied to one pipeline and tie multiple pipelines to one custom events trigger. Now you should have a basic understanding what are the different types of triggers in Azure Data Factory and how do they work. Now let's open the Azure portal and see how we can use these triggers in practice. Now we're in the Azure portal, and let's first open up our Data Factory, and you can see that I've already created several pipelines for us to use in this demo under the tutorial 4 folder. All of these pipelines just have a simple wait activity inside them, and what wait activity does, it will wait given amount of seconds. So basically our pipeline will run the amount of seconds that I have defined in the wait activity. And these wait pipelines are enough for this demo because now we are just going to demo how the triggers work without caring too much about the actual pipeline, what it does. Now let's first create a schedule trigger. Let's open our Manage tab and let's navigate to Triggers. Here we can click New and create a new trigger. Let's name the trigger according to our naming conventions. I'm going to start my trigger as trg_tutorial4, underscore demo1 underscore schedule. And now let's configure our trigger. Our trigger type is going to be schedule. Our start date is going to be as it is, because the Data Factory defaults the start date to the current time. Then the time zone is fine, we can use UTC. And then the recurrence, we want this trigger to be running every 5 minutes. And then we can click that we want to start this trigger after we have created it. Lastly, we can just click OK, and the trigger will be created. Next, we need to tie this trigger to our pipelines. So let's go back to the Author tab, and let's open our pipelines, and let's click Add Trigger. And here we can select our trigger and select OK, and we don't have any parameters, so let's click OK. And now we have successfully added this trigger to our first pipeline. Next, let's repeat this same process with our second pipeline. Let's click OK and OK. And now we have added this schedule trigger to 2 pipelines. Now we need to publish those changes so our trigger will start actually running. So let's do that. Now our publish is being done, should be done fairly soon. Now it is done. So now we have activated our first trigger in this Data Factory. Now with some YouTube magic, I will speed things up, and let's go to our Monitor tab and see how our trigger is performing. It has already started a run, and we can see that it has started to run both of these pipelines now. We can click the refresh button here to get some fresh data how our pipelines runs are going. As you can see, our 360-second pipeline is still running, but our 30-second pipeline has already completed. We can also check the Trigger Runs tab. Here we can see that our trigger has already succeeded even though the pipeline is still running. And this is due to the fire and forget nature of this trigger, which means that the trigger is marked as succeed immediately after it has kickstarted those pipelines that it's being attached to. Now let's go back to the pipeline runs. Let's again use some YouTube magic to hop forward to the next time when our schedule trigger is ran. And now we have leaped forward in time, and we can see that we have 2 new pipeline runs being triggered by this trigger. But our previous run is still going on. And now we can see, since we don't have any concurrency settings in the trigger itself, the trigger will still fire even though the previous iteration of that trigger would be still running, or the previous iteration of those pipelines that trigger has triggered are still running. Now we have gone through in Azure how the schedule trigger works, so we can go back to the Manage tab and find our trigger and pause the trigger, because we don't need to be having this running in our Data Factory and generating costs here. Next, let's cover a tumbling window trigger in action in Data Factory. Let's select our Demo2 pipeline and let's create a trigger for this pipeline. Now let's create this trigger straight from the pipeline view. This is the other option how we can create triggers. So we can click here Add Trigger and then select New instead of Existing Triggers. Here we can name our trigger according to our own naming conventions. And now let's select Tumbling Window as trigger type. The start date is fine since it's the current time. And then we can select the recurrence for every 5 minutes. We are not going to add any dependencies to this trigger, and we are not going to touch on the delay setting either, but we are going to configure the concurrency to be 1, and the rest of the settings we are going to keep as default, and we're not going to add any retries since there is not really an option that our wait pipeline would fail since there are no logic in this pipeline. And we can select the start trigger on creation. Now we can click OK, and we don't have any parameters for this pipeline, so let's just click OK. And now we have successfully created our first tumbling window trigger to this Data Factory. Now we can click Publish, so it will activate our trigger. Publish should be done fairly soon. Now it is done. And now we can start monitoring our trigger. Let's go to the Monitor tab, and here we can see some previous trigger runs from our previous schedule trigger that we demonstrated before, but we are not now interested in those runs any longer, so we want to see Demo2 pipeline run here. Again, with some YouTube magic, we can speed things up and hop into our first trigger run. Now we have jumped forward, and here we can see our first trigger run for our demo 2 pipeline. And this pipeline will run 420 seconds, which is 7 minutes. So it will run longer than our 5-minute time window. Again, we can check the trigger runs tab, and here we can see a difference between the schedule trigger and the tumbling window trigger. Here we can see that the tumbling window state is running when the schedule trigger always succeeded immediately after it had triggered those pipelines, because the tumbling window trigger is interested in the pipeline state. It will wait for the return value of the pipeline, and for example, if there are retry policies defined and the pipeline has failed, it will try to retry the pipeline based on the retry configuration. Again, I will speed things up and hop a few minutes forward to our next trigger window. Now we have hopped a few minutes onwards, and we can see that our pipeline has been running now over 5 minutes, which means that our next pipeline run should have begun according our time interval that we defined for this trigger. But it is not running because we defined that the concurrency for this trigger is 1, so there can be only one instance of this trigger running at given time. Also in the trigger run page we can see that our tumbling window is still in the running status, so the trigger is still running. Now again, let's hop a few minutes forward. Let's hop to the 7-minute mark when our trigger should be finished. Now our trigger has been running for 7 minutes, so our pipeline should be done, and it is done. Then we can open our trigger runs page, and here we can see that we have just a new tumbling window trigger starting to run, and this has triggered our demo 2 pipeline. And because we defined that concurrency setting, we didn't have 2 demo 2 pipeline runs running at the same time. Now we have gone through the basics of tumbling window triggers, so we can go to the manage tab and find our trigger and pause it because we don't want it to be running here in the data factory. The last trigger that we are going to cover in this video is going to be storage events trigger. And now let's add a storage events trigger to our demo 3 pipeline. Let's click add trigger, and let's select a new trigger since we don't want to use any existing ones. Let's name our trigger according to our naming conventions. Let's select the storage events as our trigger type, and now let's select our storage account that we created in the previous videos. And I have already created a new container to the storage account that we are going to use for this demo. And let's select that. And now we want to set our configuration so that our blob path ends with .csv, and we want to only monitor blob created events. And we will be ignoring empty blobs. And our trigger will be created on creation. Now we can click continue. And now Data Factory is trying to find some blobs from that container that match to our configuration, but there are none yet. So we can just click continue. And then we don't have any parameters, so just click OK. Now we have created the storage event trigger, so we have to publish that, so it will be activated. Now let's wait for a few seconds for our publish to finish. It should be done any second now. Now it is done. Now we can navigate to our storage account and find our blob container that we are going to use in this demo. Let's open that. And now we can start uploading files and see what happens in Data Factory when we do that. Let's first upload our file 1.csv, and this file has some content in it, so meaning that the file is not empty. This file should match all our configuration specs and it should fire our trigger. Let's see what happens. Now I will again speed things up a bit, and let's hop into our Data Factory where we can see that our demo 3 pipeline has already ran once. So everything worked fine. And in the trigger runs page, we can see that we have one storage event trigger that has fired. Now we can go back to our storage account and upload our second file. This is going to be file2.csv, and this file has some contents, so it should trigger a new Data Factory pipeline run, and the demo 3 pipeline is running once again. Let's upload some more files. Let's upload file3.csv, but this file is now empty, so it shouldn't trigger our pipeline run because we have ignored empty files. And as we can see, we don't have any new pipelines running here. Okay, let's go back to our storage account. Let's upload file number 4. This time it's called file4.txt. So because it has the txt ending, it should not trigger any new pipeline runs. And we can confirm that in the Data Factory. We don't have any new pipeline runs. And then we can upload file 5.csv, and this file has content, so it should match our criteria, that is .csv, and it has content. So let's see Data Factory that did this file start any new pipeline runs. And in fact it did, and we have that previous run just finished when that one started. But because storage events trigger is also fire and forget, it doesn't care about that if the previous run is still running or not, so they could be running at the same time. Now we can go back to the Manage tab and also disable this storage events trigger because we don't really need it for anything. Now we have covered Azure Data Factory triggers also in practice. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button and consider subscribing to the channel. Also, all the materials used in this video can be found in the link in the description. In the next video of this series, we are going to cover Azure Data Factory parameters. So, stay tuned and see you in the next video.